Thank you again for the invitation. The thing that I want to talk about really, I guess, is the thing that I spend basically all of my free time and energy kind of thinking about, which is the climate impact of games. I started this I guess this journey to becoming one of the you know most experienced people in terms of like thinking about games and its impact. Like several years ago, I started in about 2015, and I have been going ever since. So I've accumulated quite a lot of like, I don't know, just interesting knowledge, lots of contacts in the industry. And I've got to do some really fun things as well. And what I want to talk about, I guess, is where I'm up to at the moment on my like really big picture project of trying to figure out what the single number is, like what is the full footprint of the in total games industry in the world, which we still don't know. We have little bits and pieces of it, and I'll talk about what I have been able to kind of piece together so far. And then I want to talk a little bit about what we can do about it. And the thing that I think is most interesting, particularly as future game designers or game thinkers, game critics, game academics, researchers, is the role of cultural leadership and changing expectations about what we expect from games and game making as a industry. So a little bit of my kind of background. I have a PhD in vaguely human, non-human philosophy. So I started my PhD in 2010, and I finally finished in late 2014. And it was about games communities. It started out being about how people were writing about games online, how they were kind of coming up with ideas about, I guess it was trying to define some of these early ideas that we now call like discourse around games, I suppose. And in doing that, I ended up kind of going down this rabbit hole of all these other questions that were intimately related to that, like what's the role of non-human objects in thinking about how we act on the world and how we are responsible in the world and how we are responsible actors in the world. And after I finished that project, I started thinking about games, and I needed another big project to kind of work on. I was still an academic then. I was, angling for an academic career. And I went, all right, well, what can I do in my sphere of influence? Because I had been reading about climate change. I've always kind of cared about it. And I just decided to like take it seriously and think about what does the game industry need to know? What does it need to think about? What does it need to do to be sustainable? And that project took about 7 years. Finally finished in 22 when it came out as Digital Games After Climate Change. And now I sort of continue that work with my newsletter, Greening the Games Industry, and the sort of business I started last year. Sorry, not last year, mid 2022. Year's changed, hasn't it? Which I started to be able to do a bit of advocacy to help companies that are just starting out, figuring out what their kind of impact is and what they can kind of do about it. I write a newsletter that anyone can kind of subscribe to, where I talk about the kind of the latest news that's happening from a sustainability perspective in the games industry. And I've been very fortunate in the last like 18 months, I suppose, to have worked with Unity. I did some work for them. I wrote a white paper about what a kind of labeling system might look like for games to kind of show how, or to allow customers, gamers to say, all right, which are the most green games? And, maybe that influences their purchasing decision or their choices about how they play or when they play or where they play, what that sort of looks like. I gave a talk to the board of CD Projekt Red about, just a big overview of like, what are all the games companies in the world, the biggest games companies doing on climate? What sort of action are they taking? What does that look like? How much money are they putting towards it? What are investors interested in? What sort of questions are being asked of games companies by legislation and governments, by players, increasingly sustainably minded players. I did a little bit of work for Keywords Australia, which is part of a big international organization. I did some numbers for them, thinking about, how much it would cost them to basically pay for all the carbon that they are emitting annually. I helped a little studio called Co-op in Montreal to understand what it takes to calculate your own carbon footprint and then do something about it. And then I worked with Paper House here in Melbourne, who produced a wonderful little iOS game called Paperbark. And I'm working on a climate-themed game called Wood and Weather, which will be out, I don't know when, but hopefully not before too long. And I worked with Dagut Fabrique most recently to help them understand what the total footprint of the production of their most recent game, Saltsea Chronicles, is, and what they could kind of do about it next time to kind of improve the kind of impact it has and reduce the impact. Yeah, so the kind of work that I do is I produce inventories of greenhouse gas emissions for companies. I do research on how to reduce those emissions. I do benchmarking and reporting for games companies. I look at the disclosures every year of all the biggest game companies in the world and just tally it all up and see how much they say they're emitting. And then I try and help game developers also to understand what they can do differently and how to improve their footprint. So the arc of the presentation today is I want to start with the kind of doom and gloom stuff, right? I want to start with the current climate context, which really has to be at the front of our mind, right? With everything that we do in terms of sustainability, we have to know why we're taking this sort of action and what sort of scale and scope of change we're really talking about and what sort of what it really demands of us this moment that we're in, right? What's the situation that we're in? And being really clear-eyed about that and quite frank about what's involved. And what the world's responses are and how governments around the world are deciding to address the sort of climate issue, because that also has its impact on the games industry. It sort of trickles down from the largest institutions, the UN and so on. And then I'll talk about the global footprint of the games industry, the numbers that I've been able to come up with so far. And that's through the process, the net zero snapshot that I do every year, which I publish on After Climate on our website. I'll talk about the scale of those emissions and what are the comparisons we can make, where those emissions are kind of happening in the production process of games. And then I'll sort of touch on, beyond just this, the very beginning question of CO2 emissions. We'll also talk about what other kinds of environmental impacts are involved. So, from mining and minerals and resource extraction and waste and all those sorts of things, that's even longer kind of presentation or discussion. So yeah, we'll just kind of briefly touch on that. And then I'll end by summing up with or talking about the kind of action that is possible at the really small scale, right? So for most of us in this room, we're not we don't have the hands on the levers of power that someone at Nintendo or Ubisoft or a CEO or someone in those sorts of positions is going to be, or a financier or an investment manager or something. So the potential that I see for people who are not at that really high commercial level to take action, what the constraints are, and also what the opportunities are. So that's where we're going. So probably this is not going to be new to you, but I think it's really important to just look at the numbers again and see that before we dive into anything else. The IPCC says that we've warmed the planet at least 1 degree, probably 1.1 degrees above the average of, pre-industrial revolution. And that is a hell of an achievement, really, when you think about it. That is a lot of energy. Think about it at the scale of the planet. So we are good job us. But what that means is that we are really, really in quite a dire situation, right? Like the 2015 Paris Agreement, it said, all right, well, the scientists, the best climate scientists in the world say we really need to keep warming below 2 degrees. And really, ideally, unless we want to like basically live with huge levels of disasters and unplanned emergencies, then we need to keep warming even below that to keep it to 1.5 degrees. And so the world came together in 2015 and signed the Paris Agreement and said, yes, we will agree to these, this particular framing. That's how we're going to approach the next century, basically. And the way that the governments approach that is that they make nationally determined contributions to that. So they say, all right, here's our footprint at the moment. Here's what we'll pledge to reduce by a certain date. And then they will set the policy in their different jurisdictions about how to get there. So, and that obviously has like a really, really big difference depending on where you are around the world, and for good reason, right? To give you a sense though of where games fit or how much of a potential slice of this pie, the national kind of contribution of games in some ways is Mills and a couple of other authors, I think, from the Berkeley Energy Lab did a study in 2019 on the total number. They just estimated the total number of gaming devices in the US and figured that they used probably around about 2.4% of all electricity in the US in that year. And when you say, all right, well, where does that electricity come from? A lot of it comes from fossil fuels. It's got a footprint of about 24 million tons of CO2 per annum. So that's just the US, just every year. And, there are only more and more devices. As we've seen, this generation of console uses more power. Some of the latest graphics cards use like crazy amounts of power in PC. So those numbers are only going to go up, at least in terms of energy. The intensity of grids, I don't know, that might change, but no one's done that work yet to figure out. And just another month or so ago, I think it was in November or early December, another report was released showing the pace of change that the world is kind of achieved so far. Only one indicator out of, I think it was 42, is actually changing at the rate that we need to hit the kind of global targets to keep warming under 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. And that was electric vehicle sales, EVs. So, we're doing all right when there's lots of money to be made in, transitioning to EVs. It's a very like lucrative business opportunity, but in lots of others, we're really not progressing, which is a huge bummer. And even in the electricity sector, which is where a lot of the games industry's emissions come from, the pace of change is accelerating, but it's not accelerating enough. Yeah, you can look at this this report yourself if you're interested in this idea of the pace of change, because that's really what is going to determine the long-term outlook of the planet. Is like, it's not just can we get to net zero, but it's how quickly can we get there. If we get there by slamming on the brakes at the very last minute, then like we're going to blow well past the limits that we need. So, and to give you another further drilled down perspective, I live in Australia. Australia is an extremely fossil fuel dependent country. We export a huge amount of coal and natural gas. And we act like it too. We act like a fossil fuel state. Our per capita emissions from electricity are up there with the Gulf states, basically. Lots of other parts of the world are decarbonizing, but here in Australia, it's still really slow. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of reasons for that, but yeah. So have a look at where your country is too. Hopefully, it's in better shape. It probably is. So that kind of big political framework is what's driving businesses as well to start responding to climate. The main reasons or the initial drivers that set a lot of these sort of changes in motion are specific regulations, particularly around the disclosure of CO2 emissions and targets and like things like carbon taxes and stuff like that, particularly in Europe. So Europe had one of the first very early requirements to disclose CO2 emissions from the 2014 non-financial reporting directive, which they've updated to become corporate sustainability reporting directive in 2022, and which is about to come into force this year. So a whole bunch of new companies are having to wake up and go, oh, we actually have to calculate our footprint and share it with the world and air our dirty laundry for everyone and anyone to see. In the US, just last year, California introduced probably the US's most stringent disclosure laws of that we've ever seen, saying that if you're a particular size company, you have to disclose emissions from a particular year. Off the top of my head, I think it's 2026 that it starts in, maybe 2025, but it's soon. And so big companies are scrambling to go, oh, okay, where are our biggest emissions? What can we do to reduce them? Because they know that the competition is also having to do the same thing. And if another company looks better, maybe the investors go to them rather than this company. So there are financial drivers behind it too. The change in investment to kind of prioritize this you may have heard of this acronym ESG, which stands for environment, social and governance. Off the top of my head, again, it's struggling to get it out. Yeah, environment, social, and corporate governance is a way that or a framework that lots of publicly traded companies are using to disclose their emissions and address other kind of non-financial reporting. Things like the gender makeup or the diversity of their boards and management group, or just hiring practices, things like that. All these sorts of new regulations are kind of starting to bear down on companies, and they're starting to take action. And that's also being reflected in consumers too. So consumers are like, well, what are you doing? I want to see that the companies that I'm giving my money to are behaving in a responsible way. And that means sustainability. It means being a responsible corporate citizen, basically. And yeah, it is still a contested terrain, though. It's not as simple as I know. I think it has different. It gets different reception in different parts of the world. So in the US, there's quite a bit of pushback around this idea of ESG investing, with some people saying like, oh, it's only really going to be a hindrance for business. Yeah, all this sort of stuff. So it's not a straightforward open and shut kind of situation. So in light of that sort of big kind of long trajectory and trends, I do every year a summary snapshot of where the games industry is up to on its climate action. So I started by looking at which games companies have pledged to achieve net zero, basically to operate in a way that the science tells us we have to, and who hasn't. And I've been doing that for 2 years now, and it's sort of expanded to cover the following games companies you see here, as well as 5 to 6 very big tech companies that have large kind of involvement in the games industry as well. The platform holders like Sony, Nintendo, Google, Apple, Microsoft. Yeah. And so what I did this year for the first time was I tallied up all the emissions that they disclosed. And when you add it all up, all of those companies, they have 81 million tons of CO2 that they said they emitted into the atmosphere in 2022. And to give you a sense of the scale of that, that's a little bit bigger than the country of Libya emitted the year before in 2021, which is 7 million people, a bit of a Gulf state. and is only slightly less than the country of Colombia, which has 50 million people in it. So a big chunk of that, though, is the really big companies like Google, Google, Microsoft, Sony. Any company that actually makes physical things like TVs or electronics that they sell, physical stuff, is really hard to produce in a sustainable way. So there's lots of kind of embedded emissions in that. But even with those ones taken out of the picture, just the games companies, it's somewhere between 7 to 15 million tons of CO2 emissions per year, which is still a lot. It's still yeah, quite a significant chunk, right? And that's just producing games, really. Like that's kind of the upstream part of making games, using servers, lighting, heating for offices, flying around the world to go to conferences, to market your games, sell your games. It's maybe advertising. It's a whole bunch of things, but it's not largely, it's not the players themselves. Yeah. And there's been some research that says that, well, companies, what a surprise, actually don't often disclose 100% of their emissions, right? Like they get to choose which categories they disclose. And sometimes that's as much as half of the total, right? You can say, all right, this is not relevant. We don't have control over it. It's our players. And so you don't mention it. But that can be as much as half of the emissions. So basically, double that figure might be reasonable, but we'll come back to it. So if we think about it from a carbon budget perspective, how much CO2 can we keep emitting until we cross this 1.5 degree threshold or 2 degrees? It's probably 0.02%. So it doesn't seem like, from that perspective, it doesn't seem super significant. There are obviously other things that are much bigger, but like when we cumulatively add it up over all that time, it becomes about 0.2%, almost 0.2% of all the remaining carbon budget left if we just make games. It's like that's a measurable fraction of the planet's budget. I don't know about you, but that makes me feel very uncomfortable that we're engaging in leisure activities and this is the cost, right? Like it's a fractional percent of our remaining budget. I feel like we could probably, if push came to shove, right? Like there are probably other things we might decide to spend it on if it were that much of an emergency. Yeah, and so again, the last point there is that just most games companies don't disclose the end user emissions. So the players of their games are often left out of that footprint. So I have tried to put them back in, as well as a bunch of other little parts of the game production process. So this is a diagram taken from quite an old bit of work, but it's still, I think, a reasonably good diagram of the game production process. And I simplify it down to just a couple of categories. So this is from John's 2016 article, which I think is a really interesting one. If you're interested in the production process of games and the networks of power and what happens where, take a look at that one because it's quite foundational. So simplifying that diagram though down into just a couple of stages. This is my own diagram or my own kind of like contribution to the diagram. Sorry, it's a little bit small, but basically there's hardware emissions in the top left. So making game hardware. So consoles, PCs. Yeah, the figures that I have, PS4s, the lifetime emissions of making PS4s was about 5 million tons of CO2. The lifetime emissions of making Xbox Ones was about 8.6. In the bottom left, that's the software production side of things. That 60 million tons figure is my own estimate based on a rough idea of how many game developers there are in the world and a reasonable guess at how intense or how many CO2 per employee most companies emit, most big games companies. So there's a little bit of wiggle room in there. Distribution of discs around the world or digital downloads is up there in the middle. PS4 discs, every single PS4 disc made had a carbon footprint of about 270 grams, which is not that much, but when you total that up by the number of games sold, it's, you know, in the millions of tons over, you know, the lifespan of the PS4. And then end users, gamers themselves. So the Mills and Mills figure was for about, I think, 2016. That was 24 million tons every year. And I think Joshua Aslan in his PhD study found that PS4 users in Europe across the lifespan, excuse me, of that console probably emitted, again, 3.6-ish million tons. And then there's a whole bunch of the industry we just don't have much data on. So live service games, what about servers? What about, you know, voice and data transmission, streaming? It's not really kind of in here anywhere. Digital retailing, Steam, Valve themselves is a really, really private and secretive company that they, you know, they really don't disclose anything. I think they're going to have to soon, just because of this Californian law. But basically, we have no idea. We have no idea what the footprint is of digitally downloading off Steam, although it's probably less than if everyone was buying discs. But and then there's what happens to games and game hardware and devices after we're done with them. You know, do they go to landfill? Do they get recycled? And what sort of emissions do they have? What sort of other environmental impacts does that have on the planet? So this is just my summary slides of, yeah, those sort of figures I just kind of glossed over, and some of the sources for where those figures are. Some of them are my own calculations, which I've done on my newsletter, like the discs, you know, all of the PS4 discs, if we stacked them up, they would stack to about 9 kilometers tall. So that's a lot of plastic we've produced to make console games, and that's not even including the cases as well, the plastic cases. Where's all that plastic gone? It's probably not been recycled. It's probably ended up in landfill or, you know, in warehouses, and then, yeah, eventually just gets dumped. Yeah, so that's the sort of the big picture, the CO2 stuff. This is the challenge that the game industry faces. And then, yeah, I just wanted to really briefly touch on the sort of hardware side as well of this idea of, you know, the stuff, the afterlife of the things that we use to play games on, and where they go, because that's also a sustainability challenge as well. So in digital games after climate change, I was really interested in this question of like, where has the materials come from as well? There's you know, quite a bit of research on sort of the challenge of e-waste and the kind of things that need to happen to sort that out, and you know, it's a huge kind of issue, but there's less awareness, I think, of the impacts upstream of what it takes to make the devices in the first place. So I wanted to find out, like, where do the materials come from that go into a PS4? And so to do that, I needed to know, what are the materials inside a PS4, especially the rare stuff, right? Probably things like capacitors and, you know, copper wire and things that we can say, all right, well, it's copper, it's come out of the ground somewhere, but what is actually inside the thing that does a lot of the actual work, the CPU, the GPU? So in the book, I went and I got an old PS4 and I took it to the science lab at my old university and asked them to tell me what was in it. And they took a tiny sample. They like guillotined a piece of the GPU, CPU, GPU out of the, you know, the motherboard. Then they dissolved it in a really strong acid. And then they blasted it with microwave radiation, and it like just atomizes the entire contents of it, and it produces a readout of all of the atomic elements, or almost all of the atomic elements inside that sample. And here's the list of them. I circled all of the ones that were detected in the sample. Now this is a pretty like accurate test, so it's picking up like a lot of stuff at very tiny amounts. And they couldn't tell me as well exactly how much was in it, because that would be like, you know, a really, really expensive test. They did this for me on like basically no money. but they gave me a list of the ones that are more likely to be present in higher quantities. So magnesium, aluminium, titanium, chromium, nickel, copper, zinc, gallium, palladium, silver, cadmium, indium, tin, barium, gold, lead, and bismuth. And I looked at those elements in particular in the book, and I went and looked up in the research literature where they come from. I tried to figure out what sort of use it had in a CPU, like, what sort of role does it play electronically, maybe. Yeah, the results were like absolutely fucking terrifying. Like some of these materials are mined in incredibly destructive ways. They produce incredible amounts of waste, both waste rock, but also waste chemicals or heavy metals and lead. The idea that lead and cadmium is in the PS4 CPU, GPU, even in like tiny amounts, is actually terrifying. Those things are extremely toxic. We don't want them anywhere near landfill because they will, leach out over time and poison water supplies and all that sort of stuff. So one little example that I think is sort of illustrative of the kinds of upstream mining kind of impacts, environmental impacts, is the mining of magnesium. And so a lot of the world's magnesium comes from this one province in China. And until I think it was around about 2014 or so, a really big way that this magnesium was mined was they would just blow up a hillside and, scrape it off and then send it away to the refinery. And it leaves these huge craters in the earth. Like this is a picture from, Liaoning province in China. And obviously like this landscape is just, like devastated for huge areas. And the process of using explosives to break up the earth also threw up a huge amount of like dust. And when that dust is in the air and it rains, the water droplets capture the dust on the way down and it lands on the surface of the soil and actually changes the chemistry of the topsoil. So it affects the area around it by making it, I think it makes it a bit alkaline, but it forms a sort of hard crust so that, water runs off really quickly and maybe doesn't soak into the soil as well. So it has these other flow-on effects as well, beyond like just the visible stuff. Yeah, so it reacts with the water in the air and the soil and produces magnesium carbonate and magnesium hydroxide, making the soil pH increase, which is not great for that local environment. So shifting back to like the real what can we do about it kind of stuff. I'm going to talk now a little bit about the report that I produced for Dagut Fabrik, because I think that's where we can see some really interesting potential for intervening in some of these cycles, I suppose, of environmental destruction and CO2 emissions and stuff like that. Like basically what they wanted me to do was to tell them what's the footprint of this new game they produced, Salt Sea Chronicles, which is a great little game too, by the way. So we calculated the footprint by looking at the number of people who are working on the game, the hours they worked. We did a survey of the development team and said, okay, when are you working from home? Or how do you work from home? What sort of devices do you have? What kind of heating do you have in your house? Is it gas heating? Is it, district central heating? Is it a heat pump, running off electricity? And then we also looked at the purchase data that they have in their business accounts. So basically everything they spent money on besides wages for developers, we looked at and said, all right, what's the kind of embedded carbon? What sort of cost does purchasing that had on the planet? And we used a particular database from the US, which has some gives us useful figures for each dollar spent in this amount is probably this much CO2. And then we also looked at the travel they did to just 2 conferences and sorry, three conferences they went to, and the sort of emissions from travel. because this is where like the rubber hits the road, right? This is how we produce games and how we make games and the sort of impact that that actually has. So the results of that process was that it told us the entire game, making this one indie game for 3.5 years, had a total of 47 tons of CO2, or produced a total ton of 47 tons of CO2, which when you compare that to the total of the entire games industry, you know, in the millions, it's actually nothing, right? Like it's so little an amount that it's almost not worth bothering about, you know, in the grand scheme of things. But obviously, you know, we can't all, because there's so many of us, we can't just like ignore it, right? Even 47 tons of CO2 is 47 tons we don't want in the atmosphere. We broke down the emissions by like the source, so we could see like, all right, well, this is what's producing all those emissions, and came up with some metrics that let us say like, okay, how do we compare them to other companies in the games industry and other like larger companies as well as indies, and came up with some recommendations, the things that they can do differently to reduce that impact in the future. So starting with the recommendations, I first suggested that they try and start an annual emissions process. So they want to calculate their emissions every year rather than doing it every 3.5 years when they get a game out, because that's kind of too slow of a feedback cycle. To really know if you're having a difference, you need to actually change something, be able to observe it, and then, you know, see what the result is. And then, yeah, if it's a good change, then you stick with it. And if it's not, you know, you go back to something else. 3.5 years between calculations is a bit too long. And yeah, most companies will do an annual kind of emissions process. So I also suggested that they set a target for net zero and work towards reducing the work from home emissions of their team, and try and reduce the amount of travel that they do, or figure out ways of traveling that are more CO2 friendly, because that was a really, really big part of it. The number one biggest part of their footprint was just a couple of plane trips that blew out the entire budget, basically doubling it, just catching a few planes, which was a huge and interesting result, I think. And then I'll come back to this idea of eco-labeling as a potential outcome too. So this is a couple of the charts that we produced in the report. On the left-hand side, this is scope 1 and 2 emissions per employee at a number of different indie studios. Scope 1 and 2 emissions are the most ones that you kind of have control over. They are burning fossil fuels yourself. So any kind of gas you burn, any fuel you burn in a car or a diesel generator, maybe. It's a little bit rare to have scope 1 emissions, but scope 2 is emissions from electricity. And the CO2 emitted to produce the power that you use in your home office or your work, or whatever. So totaling them up, yeah, per employee CO2 emissions for indie studios, pretty tiny, like, you know, less than 1 ton each per year. When we compare that to some of the biggest companies in the world, they're talking about like 5, 10, 7 tons of CO2 per employee per annum. Which is, yeah, like another order of magnitude bigger than most indie studios. And on the right-hand side, this graph is the breakdown of the different sources of CO2. So travel on the left-hand side was the biggest single item of on the entire kind of footprint. That was just 4 plane trips, I think, going to South by Southwest Sydney, flying from the UK to Australia and back again, and from the UK to the US for GDC. Just those 2 trips. It basically is like, it's more than work from home emissions for 3.5 years. It's more than all the purchases that the Danish part of the studio made, and more than purchases in the UK. So even though, like, yeah, there are emissions involved in in making these games, when we compare them again to the bigger companies in the world, we almost don't even see them on the chart. This is a logarithmic scale graph on the right-hand side here, of this sort of per employee per annum emissions. The bigger the bubble, the more employees, and the bigger the company, and the smaller ones are obviously the indie studios. So there's something we can say about indie games, or if there's something we could say about indie game making, it's probably that they are kind of the best way to make games for the planet, like from an environmental perspective. And even though the emissions is like, quite small in comparison to the rest of the industry, like all emissions have to go to zero eventually, or else we're in deep trouble. The question that I am most, I think, yeah, we need to kind of keep in mind though, and balance up against is like, what sort of power do indies actually have to reduce their emissions though? Like if they're such a small part of their emission, if they have to bust their gut to get to net zero versus Apple or Tencent or these other huge, rich and powerful companies, yeah, there's a mismatch there. I think there's something a little bit something a bit inequitable about it. So the number one thing that studios can do is avoid flights. It's the single biggest impact. On the right here is a chart of the emissions avoided by taking the train from Manchester to Cologne versus flying. It's a huge amount, and it's not like it's a huge burden to travel in that way. If you have access to that, right? Like, so if you're in Europe, great, go by train. The train networks are great. If you are based in Australia though, and you want to go to GDC, there's not really a train that goes to the United States. You could get a boat, but it would be really slow, and I just don't think that that's even really easy to find. So yeah, it's hard. It's hard to say. It's hard to definitively answer, like, what are these things that we can do better? If you have the ability to do them, if you're in a place where you can avoid flying, yeah, do it. There were other few little things that we can kind of suggest that are like quite a bit harder. Things like picking better suppliers. When you have a data center in your game, if you're making like a live service game or you have some sort of online multiplayer component, there might be a data center that you can pick that runs off renewables, has a lower footprint than maybe like an Amazon AWS server, which is, yeah, can be quite carbon intensive. Yes, keep the seminar series online. Yeah, don't fly people out. I try and avoid flying out to Europe if I can. I just don't like planes as well. But like, yeah, the footprint of it is insane. Yeah, there are some really standout items that appeared in Dogut Fabric's footprint as well that were possible to change. One of them was cut flowers, which is quite a surprising thing. So to commemorate milestones and to have a sense of the company. So they're an entirely remote business. They don't have any offices. So to keep them sort of connected, they do little team building things. They send each other like flowers and lunches and stuff like that. And the purchased flowers was turning up as like a kind of really big part of their purchased footprint. And that's because a lot of flowers in Europe are grown in Africa, like in Kenya specifically, and then they get cut, they get put on a plane, refrigerated, and then flown to Europe and sold in florists. So like, yeah, there are these hidden kind of emissions behind certain products sometimes. But yeah, who has the power to really address these emissions? Like, employees have a little bit of control over how much power they use at home, but really it's a question of national energy grids, the kind of legacy infrastructure like coal-fired power plants, which we're dealing with here in Australia, which is a really big part of why our footprint is so massive. what governments are doing to support it. Those sorts of things are much more significant than, you know, switching your lights off when you leave the room or something, you know, like it's not really action at the scale that the problem demands. The travel question, when we can change, you know, the travel mode, great. But as Dogu Fabric told me, like, you know, there are some kinds of travel they just can't avoid. If they want to sell their game, they have to go to visit publishers. Publishers go to conferences and take lots of meetings there. They don't do it online. They won't come to you. And so, yeah, some of that travel is kind of unavoidable. We almost need the industry to go and rethink the way that it does business and does its like kind of deal making and pitching games and things like that. We need to change the expectations around this, and that's really hard. And choice of suppliers, again, you know, like picking the more sustainable data center. Again, it's like you can do those things, but how much time and effort does it do it? If it, you know, takes all of your time and effort, yeah, like it might not be feasible. So indies and small scale game making is under a huge amount of pressure, especially in the last, you know, 12 months. Indies have a huge and precarious situation they're in. The amount of like layoffs and deals that, you know, the lack of investment in the last 12 months is a real challenge for games industry, for indies and their sustainability. Like there's no point in being the greenest game studio if you then just shut down, right? They're also like the smallest footprints and with the least ability to control it. So yeah, it's real tough. And a tough time, I think, to be in India as well. So excuse me. There are some reasons to be optimistic though. The real big movers and shakers in the industry are now starting to wake up to this challenge, and particularly Microsoft. Microsoft has one of the most aggressive, ambitious net zero targets of any company in the world, and they seem to be quite serious about actually achieving it. In late 2022, early 2023, Microsoft and Epic teamed up together to use some new tooling they put in the Xbox dev kits, basically, to figure out how to save end user emissions, right? How to save energy on consoles. And they tried a bunch of different things, and they looked at the way that people played the game Fortnite and said, okay, when they're sitting on a menu screen, do we really need to render at 120 frames? Probably not. Do you need to, you know, have like the full resolution scale? No, probably not. And so by scaling that back, just by being idle, they saved a whole bunch of power on menus to the tune of about 80 megawatt hours a day. And that's like the equivalent of a really small wind farm just through software changes. And they produced a guide for anyone else to kind of like reproduce this sort of work and, you know, best practice learnings from this sort of thing, which I think is really, really, really useful. And I think that's what we're going to see in the next couple of years too. I think if this becomes a kind of default, you know, just rolled out in engines in, you know, games going forward, then yeah, it makes like a significant dent when you've got a lot of players. A question in the chat was, could we see in the future more use of online meetings, and what's the carbon footprint of that? That's a good question. I hope that we do. The carbon footprint question is like, it's almost certainly going to be better than flying a whole bunch of people around the world, but yeah, those headsets are also pretty, yeah, there's a lot of emissions that goes into making like a device, right? I think if we're just doing this to make another company rich by buying another gaming device, maybe that's not the best approach, but we'll see. We'll see. So to wrap up this this section and kind of, you know, bring it to a close, the way that I think about the opportunities that game developers and game makers and game critics and academics have is through this lens of cultural leadership. Indie game makers, people not at these big companies, have visibility, right? They have the ability to set, you know, expectations amongst gamers, amongst their audience. They can demonstrate a best practice, just like Dagut Fabrique, right? And indies are already kind of at the cutting edge, right? We're used to them being, the most socially, politically, creatively progressive game makers, really. And they also will have, the vantage point of being able to say, well, if we can do it, why can't, Microsoft or Sony or Nintendo? And yeah, Nintendo has a lot of catching up to do. There's a lot they could be doing. So yeah, the visibility, I think, is a real opportunity there. But again, it can only happen if they survive. And yeah, there's a whole bunch of other little asterisks after that too, right? Little caveats, which I'm sure you can kind of figure out and work through. So to draw it all to a close, I think climate action has never been more obviously urgent, more incredibly necessary, and the kind of pressures to decarbonize have never been more real and concrete. And I see that all around the world. I see that all through games. I see that all through other industries as well. So that's a positive. That's kind of good. Is the pace of change happening that we need? Probably not yet, but it could be. And yeah, I think it's really, really encouraging that yeah, I get asked to do more and more of these talks. Yeah, over the last couple of years. Basically, when I first started this when I put out the book, I felt kind of like a voice in the wilderness. I'm out here saying like, games have an environmental footprint. We can't keep doing these things, and it was sort of not really on anyone's radar. But now it's like, sustainability has become a central question, I think. So that's encouraging. The games industry snapshot, the net zero snapshot I do, shows that, the footprint of the total industry is huge. It's actually really big and really significant. It's at game development, it's at end users, it's gamers, and then a whole bunch of other question marks as well. And that, I think, kind of guides a lot of my thinking in terms of where I think we should be acting in a way to decarbonize, focusing on the development and end users. That's like where I think the most emissions are. And the indie scale impacts, even though they're insignificant, relatively speaking, the real power, I think, is in being visible about it and having that sort of cultural leadership role, starting conversations, making it be, put on the agenda. And yeah, that's what I'm kind of excited to do and see happen in the next few years. If you want to stay in touch with me and the work I do, yeah, you can follow me on Twitter if you want. I just mostly retweet stuff now. I'm also on Mastodon there, or the best place is to check out my newsletter. And yeah, thanks for listening, and we'll look at some of the questions in the chat, I think, as well.